is making these services available free of charge to New York-based organizations that collect, preserve, and make accessible historic records and/or library research materials. DHPSNY is a collaboration between two long-running New York programs, the New York State Archives Documentary Heritage Program and the New York State Library Conservation Preservation Program. It was established last year in 2016 by the New York State Education Department's Office of Cultural Education to ensure consistent and comprehensive services to the vast network of organizations that safeguard New York's records and make them accessible. And it is being coordinated through my organization, the Conservation Center for Art and Historic Artifacts. We are a nonprofit paper conservation lab and preservation educational organization providing conservation treatment services as well as preservation services nationwide. And again, we're located in Philadelphia. And my name is Dyani Feige. I'm the Director of Preservation Services here, and we have a lot to go over today, so I'm just going to jump right in. I'll try to save time for questions at the end, so please hold your questions for the end. So what exactly is collections management? Well, I've copied out here 3 definitions from various types of publications, one related specifically to archives, the final one related more generally to preservation, and the first one from John Simmons, although it's not explicitly stated, this is related more, his publication is more directed to museum collections. So if you read through, now or later when you're watching this, you'll see that some of these definitions are more focused on the physical care, this particularly the middle one, this preservation specific one. Some are more focused on the administration and bigger picture questions about caring for collections. But what it really comes down to is collections management is what the collections are and how we work with them, and that can be looked at in a broad range of different ways. But many of the ways that we are looking at collections management are answering some of the really big picture questions about how we care for and deal with our collections on a day-to-day basis. So often we hear the words collections management in terms of a collections policy, collections management policy. So I'm going to start by just going over a little bit the framework that might identify how an institution or organization would approach collections management. A collections management policy is a detailed statement of why an institution is in operation and how it goes about its businesses. It can be thought of in some ways as a consolidated collection of other policies. We'll see on the next slide a sample kind of table of contents list of everything that might be included in a collections management policy, and you'll see that it covers quite a lot of different topics and areas. For an archive, a collections management policy would define the scope of the collection, give collection staff or volunteers the authority to make decisions and carry out procedural actions and decisions. It would provide guidelines for appraisal, and it keeps the staff operating, again, within a conceptual framework, within an overall guideline for collections management. So it's really important that it serves as a guide for staff and volunteers. As it mentions also on this slide, the collections management policy will also often articulate professional standards. So a collections management policy would probably adhere to standards set out through, for example, the Society of American Archivists, the American Association for State and Local History, the Museum Alliance of America. And it also would describe the relationship among the organization and its collections, as well as its authorities and staff and volunteers and the outside world. So as I mentioned, here is kind of a sample list of a lot of the topics that could be covered in a collections management policy. And you'll see, hopefully, that it can help to answer some difficult questions for an institution, questions that we'll get to a little bit more throughout this afternoon, such as we have collections but aren't sure that we own them. We don't want these particular items anymore. Can we dispose of them, and how do we go about that? We keep getting offered objects that we don't really want. How can we control this? It also gives the collection staff or volunteers something to point to potential donors or researchers or outside entities who are interested in learning more about how the collection operates. A collections management policy is often, although not always, made publicly available for an organization. But basically it announces who you are and what you're going to collect. That leads into the next thing we're going to talk about, which is a collections development policy. So a collections development policy is often, I should mention, often part of a collections management policy, but it can be its own standalone document as well. A collections development policy includes the conceptual framework of the collection as well as the institution's collecting philosophy. So it would really go into how collections support the institutional mission, interpretation, exhibitions, and programming. A collections development policy outlines the needs and limits and strengths and gaps in a institution's collection. So it might identify core areas that an institution would continue to collect materials that are representative of. It might also identify mission-driven areas that are underrepresented. Basically, what a collections development policy or a collections development section of a collections management policy does is describes in detail what a repository will collect and the breadth and scope of the collections by articulating and possibly limiting some of those scope ranges. It can also identify materials that, as I mentioned, might be out of scope and therefore targets for deaccessioning, and it can help limit unsolicited donations. So a collections development policy basically, in brief, gives you a way to accept things that you want by being able to point at this document and saying, these types of collections will help us fulfill our mission, and we have outlined that here. But it also gives you the power and a way, a mechanism to turn down objects that don't fit your mission, that you can't take care of, or that are offered with strings or restrictions that you just can't fulfill. So think about the way that your collections development policy or the collections development section in your overall management policy addresses the relationship between your missions and your collections. Just a little more detail on what types of scope points a collections development policy could articulate or limit. So up here we have collections by dates, subjects, regions, languages, formats or types of materials. So again, I've mentioned a few times that a collections development policy might not only spell out what you want to continue to collect or what you strive to collect to build your collection even further, but it might explicitly identify what you will not collect. So if there are certain types of media that you cannot provide access to, you could outline that within your collections development policy. If you're not interested in dealing with and preserving born digital material, now, you could identify in your collections development policy that that is an area that you're not collecting in. So again, it gives you the authority to not accept parts of the collections. Now, it is helpful to suggest another place that collections could potentially go, and it might not be appropriate or relevant to lay that out in a collections development policy. That might be more of a conversation with a particular donor. But it's really important to remember that by accepting something, your institution is making a commitment to take care of it. So if you cannot do this for whatever reason, whether it's providing care, preservation, and storage for a certain type of media, or whether it's not being able to provide access to a certain type of collection, or for whatever other reason, you have kind of an ethical responsibility to not accept it if your institution is fairly confident that you will not be able to provide that type of care and access in the future. So those are the types of decisions and parameters that a collections development policy can help an institution with. So now we're going to move into, now that you've articulated what the collection is, what you want it to be, where you want it to go, maybe what it is not, we're going to go into the process of actually building a collection. So we've got 3 A's here. These words, acquisition, appraisal, and accession, particularly acquisition and accession, I think tend to be confused to a certain extent. So I just wanted to go ahead and provide a couple definitions here. So an acquisition is something that's acquired by an institution with or without transfer of ownership. So essentially, once an item, a collection or potential collection, walks through the door of your institution, that is an acquisition. So acquisitions, we'll get into this a bit more in a moment, but acquisitions can be donations, purchases, even loans are considered acquisitions, temporary acquisitions. An appraisal is not a monetary appraisal, which is how the non-archival world often thinks of that word, but it's just much more generally a judgment of what something is worth. And we'll get into a lot more definitions about particular types of worth and appraisals a little bit later in this program. And then an accession, this is when a collection, or excuse me, when an item or a potential collection actually becomes part of your institution's collection, is when you go through the formal process of accessioning the item. So accessioning an item or a collection is the formal transfer of ownership from one entity to another, your institution. So I mentioned that acquisition is basically anything that comes through the door, but we're going to think about acquisition right now for the purpose of this program in terms of acquisitions of materials that may become part of your collection. So where can these actually come from? Well, they can certainly be a gift or donation. They could be a bequest. Could, of course, be a purchase, a field collection where a staff member or representative from your institution is actually going out in the field and collecting. This is perhaps somewhat more common with, say, archaeological collections or natural history museums, but it could be relevant for, say, an ephemera collection where someone from your institution is going to a political rally and collecting flyers and posters and buttons from that event. Conversion of found-in collections, so that is when we will look a lot more at found-in collections a bit later, but conversion is when something with kind of undetermined ownership or status is formally turned into a collection or a potential collection. and transferring from within the institution. So this would be, for example, if you're a special collection or archive within a larger library and something transfers from the general stacks, general collections into the special collections. So there would probably be a section in your collections management policy that deals with acquisition, so an acquisition policy. This section of the policy would guide staff, volunteers, and persons interested in potentially donating their records or papers to the institution. It would outline conditions and terms that might affect the acquisition of materials. It would define who makes those acquisitions decisions, and it would probably state collections categories. Not in as great a depth as it would in a collections in a collections development policy, but just give kind of the broad strokes outlines of what collections there are. So remember, not everything that is acquired is accessioned. This portion of the policy might also outline guidelines for what happens when an item or a collection is not fully accessioned into, say, the official archives or the special collections or the museum permanent collection, but is maybe accepted and used for a teaching collection or a public use collection. So it might describe the manner in which an acquisition does not become an accession, but is not necessarily returned to the donor or originating party. So some of the questions that an acquisition policy would prompt the decision maker to ask is whether the object is consistent with the collection goals of the institution, whether the object is kind of so unusual that it presents an exceptional opportunity and thus should be given preferential consideration, even if it's maybe somewhat beyond the scope of the identified collection development policy. If an object is offered for sale, is there a comparable version or item or collection that could possibly be obtained by gift or bequest? So basically, is it worth paying for? Is there something else out there that might fulfill the mission similarly, but without quite as much a resource outlay? Can the institution give proper care to the object? So that gets back to what we were talking about with the collections development policy about how by accepting something, your institution is really making a commitment to care for that. Will the object be used in the foreseeable future? And is there a good faith intention to keep it in the collection? So basically, wanting to make sure that an institution is not accepting something with the explicit intention of turning around and deaccessioning it. Is the provenance of the object satisfactory? So do we know where it's actually coming from and who kind of the chain of custody of owners and creators up to this point has been? Is it encumbered with conditions? So we'll talk a little more about conditions and restrictions in a bit when we talk in some more depth about a deed of gift, but definitely something to consider. What are intellectual property considerations? A topic that we are not going to get into today because it could take up way more than an entire one webinar on its own, but you know, what is the status of the copyright of the material being potentially offered up for acquisition, and you know, will copyright be transferred? What are, if not, what are the access and what are the concerns with publication and providing access and all of that? And will the acceptance of the object result in major future expenses for the institution? So in committing to care for this material, are we also committing to outlaying a great deal of resources for its care? So once you have physically acquired something, an object, a collection, there would be the process of appraisal to kind of decide the worth and value of the material contained within and its worth and value to your institution in your collecting goals. So as I mentioned, this word means something a little different in the archival world. We're not thinking of monetary appraisal, although sometimes that is a consideration, but probably more in terms of insurance considerations. But we're thinking about the research potential, the worth and value of the material mostly as far as its contents and what history, research, and value it would bring in those terms to the collection. It's a very subjective process. It's very specific to each different repository, and it's very dependent upon your collections development policy. So just going through some of these different more specific types of appraisal, what type of worth and value we might actually be measuring. The intellectual value, that, as I mentioned, is assessing the worth and value of the contents. So evidential value within intellectual value is the primary value. So why material was created in the first place, documenting the creator and their activities. So evidential value would be, for example, meeting minutes of an organization. Informational value then is secondary. So if evidential value is the primary use, informational value is secondary. Materials used in a way that their creator may never have intended. So for example, immigration records. So the immigration records evidential value, its primary value is simply to record when a person entered a particular country, what their point of entry was, and some basic demographic information about that person. But immigration records can be a gold mine for genealogists. There's a wealth of information that's a little bit supplementary to that, purely transactional primary value of here they are on this date. Information on the immigrants' children, job, original nationality, place of birth, ship name, age, height, eye and hair color, name and address of relatives they're joining in their new country, amount of money, and sometimes even the possessions they're carrying. So again, you can see how that would be extremely wealthy information for genealogists or other types of historical researchers, but not the specific exact primary value of recording that information. Intrinsic value refers to the value of an item or material as objects, not the records. So this one is where we're not thinking about the content, but we're thinking about, as opposed to the words on a piece of paper, we're thinking about the piece of paper itself. So reasons for something to have a greater deal of intrinsic value might include an important signature, might be a document in someone's handwriting. It might be very specific to your institution. So if your institution collects the papers of a particular author, the manuscript in her original handwriting would be have a wealth of intrinsic value that a typescript may not have quite as much. It can also be, as I mentioned, very specific to your institution in that think about all of the different copies and editions that are out there of the publication Origin of the Species. So the however many dozenth, hundredth copy edition of that might not be so important in and of itself until you discover that that particular volume actually belonged to Clarence Darrow. So his copy of Origin of the Species would have a great deal more intrinsic value. Some other considerations, certainly there are ethical considerations that you would make during the appraisal process. Again, as we mentioned, it's unethical to take something you know you can't make accessible. It's unethical. It can be considered unethical to take something that you know that your institution cannot care for. It definitely could be considered unethical to take something, accept something that, as I mentioned, you are planning on just kind of turning around and deaccessioning. But other ethical considerations include, is there another repository that has a collecting strength that this would be a lot more appropriate for? So are we risking poaching a collection or an item from a different institution where it would also be relevant and fit their collections development policy and fulfill their mission? Other considerations include administrative value, so the actual documenting the actual workings of an organization, a ledger. Again, I mentioned meeting minutes earlier, but meeting minutes would absolutely have a great deal of administrative value as well, recording what decisions were made on what date. Age considerations, so you might make an exception about something you wouldn't normally take, for example, financial records. If you have identified within your collecting scope that you're not collecting financial records, but you might make an exception because they're so old. So the financial records, the canceled check that documents the original sale of a building to the entity that then ended up occupying it. So this might be kind of a case-by-case basis if you are making exceptions based on particularly interesting historic value. Condition, of course, physical consideration is very important for a lot of the reasons that we have previously talked about in terms of being able to care for it. I skipped over uniqueness, but that one probably kind of speaks for itself. So is the object rare and unique enough that it would create an exceptional addition to your collection? And accessibility, so considering format and staff, volunteers, and potential users being able to actually use the material. So I've mentioned previously that it's maybe considered somewhat unethical to accept something that you know your institution cannot provide access to, but it is, I should mention that if you are confident that at some point in the future you would be able to provide access to it, if it's a certain type of audiovisual material that you have a good faith intention to reformat or digitize or purchase playback equipment for at some point in the future, that would fall within the realm of being a careful steward. So that could be an accessibility consideration as well. So now we're on to the actual accessioning. So appraisal is basically where you're deciding if you want to accession a collection or material for your collection. So basically, as I mentioned, accessioning is the formal process used to legally accept an object and to record it as part of a collection. The process entails creating a permanent record for the object or collection. So it is that formal legal transfer of title from the donor or previous owner or whomever the originating entity is to the institution. And usually that happens with a deed of gift. So the deed of gift is the formal paperwork that transfers that title. A deed of gift form is a legal document. So it needs to be, if you're starting your institution from scratch and you're starting collecting from scratch and you need to generate a deed of gift form, you really ideally should have that deed of gift form vetted by someone legal. And then it absolutely needs approval by the highest power at your institution. So I can't underestimate the concept that this is a legal transfer. And so it's a legal document, and so it's crucial that it is kind of, everything's kind of above board and as formal and adhering to best practices as possible. So at the point when you are engaging with, let's use the example of a donor, because that's who is usually filling out the deed of gift when donating, giving a gift to an institution. So when enacting a deed of gift, some of the things you want to make sure of are that the donor definitely has the legal title to the collection or to the object. So in the instance of family papers, for example, depending on their legal status or the ownership status, you might have to get signatures of all the siblings or multiple family members. In order to pass the title along to an institution, the person transferring the title must then have good unrestricted title themselves. So a deed of gift, this is the document that might outline conditions and restrictions for accepting the material. So of course, any institution would want to accept items with no restrictions whatsoever, but sometimes the donation is going to be contingent upon adhering to the donor's specific wishes and preferences in terms of how the collection will be used, what will be done with the collection. One thing that I do just want to emphasize, and going forward in creating new deeds of gift or updating old deeds of gift, that you would want to make sure of, old deeds of gift forms, not the completed forms themselves recording object transfers, but thinking of your blank forms. One thing that I would want to emphasize in terms of restrictions is ideally any restriction should have a definite time period at which it ends. So if there is, if the donor doesn't want a particular collection or portion of the collection exhibited, please have them identify on the deed of gift an end date after which that collection could be exhibited. So they might want to request that a restriction happens until they pass away, but ideally it should be a specific date rather than putting the onus of figuring out if they're still alive and all of that on the collection staff. So identify a date at which conditions and restrictions would cease. A deed of gift should also address copyright. We mentioned that briefly before. Old deeds of gift might not have this, but again, if you're creating a new one or if you're updating your forms going forward, that is really crucial to include what the status of the copyright is and what the transfer of the copyright might be. So, of course, ideally, you would want, if the donor is donating the materials, you would want them to transfer copyright as well. But if they're not willing to, or if that too is going to be restricted until a certain date, the deed of gift would be where that information is recorded. A deed of gift should also address explicitly some of the rights and potentially requirements that an institution has in dealing with the collection. So many deeds of gift mention that for an archival collection, at the archivist's discretion, items or portions of the collection that have little or no archival value or duplicates or just kind of extraneous material can be discarded. So essentially giving you permission to do weeding within a collection. A deed of gift might also mention the right of an institution to exhibit the collection or not, to break up collections, and even to deaccession if necessary at the discretion of the institution. So in the accession process and the donation process and that legal transfer of title, this might be the point at which there is a monetary appraisal of the collection or objects, and it's just important to mention here that that appraisal should be conducted by a third party, often a third party suggested by the donor. So it cannot be from the donor herself, but it also should not be an appraiser who's directly representing the institution. There are ethical considerations there as well. So at the point at which a collection or object is accessioned, I mentioned previously at that point there is a permanent record created, and there's also an accession number created, and a unique identifying control number assigned to the object or collection, marked on it or at least associated with it if possible, and used in all documentation referring to that collection or object going forward. So this is the way an accession number is the way that you can kind of intellectually keep track of an object going forward. And we'll talk more about documentation a little bit later. But one really common way to assign accession numbers to objects or collections is in a 3-number system where the first number is the year, the second number is the number of the donation. So within 2017, the second donation of the year would be 2017.2 or .002, and then the third number is the portion within that overall donation that the particular object or collection represents. So the third book in a donation of 20 books might be 2017.002.003. We'll talk a little bit more about how you might assign accession numbers somewhat retroactively with found-in collections, which to my somewhat dismay, because this gets really muddy, we are going to talk about next. So found-in collections are undocumented objects or collections that remain without status after all attempts to reconcile them to existing records of the permanent collection and loan objects are completed. So this is basically collections, portions of collections, objects, materials that your institution thinks are part of the collection or are supposed to be part of the collection, but you don't have good paperwork on them. You don't have good intellectual control over them. These materials could be old loans. They could be items that you lost paperwork for, that paperwork was never done for. There was kind of a gentleman's handshake agreement when something was donated to your institution. Paperwork was incomplete. Paperwork was lost or disassociated, or perhaps paperwork and formal accession records were done, but they did not really but they did not adequately describe certain portions of the collection, so you can't really tell that the third tea kettle on the shelf is the exact third tea kettle that is referred to in a particular deed of gift from 100 years ago. So these issues found in collections are really muddy, and I'm going to talk in the next slide about some of an institution's kind of responsibilities and possible actions with found in collections are. But I do want to give a plug to a resource that has some really good information about dealing with these very sticky, muddy issues, such as found in collections, and such as old loans, permanent loans, just other problems that get really touchy for institutions in trying to be wise stewards of their collections and undertake best collections management practices. And that publication is called Collection Conundrums. There is a slide at the end of this presentation that suggests a couple of different resources, and this is one of them. So you'll see the full title and author information then. But the title is Collection Conundrums, Solving Collections Management Mysteries, and it's edited by Rebecca Buck and Jean Gilmore. It was published by the group that was then known as the American Association of Museums, now the American Alliance of Museums. So it is a bit museum focused, museum and historic collection, historic site focused, but a lot of it is relevant to archival collections as well. So one of the questions about found in collections are kind of what are your responsibilities as an institution? What are your responsibilities and what are your rights? So are these materials able to actually be legally considered part of your collection if you don't have the most formal official title transfer documentation and paperwork? And the way that that's usually handled is by determining what the abandoned property law is in your respective state. This is a legal area that is different in each state, and actually you all, assuming you're all in New York State, are a bit more fortunate than collecting institutions in some other states. So I personally live in New Jersey. So if I were working at an institution in New Jersey does not have a law on the books that addresses abandoned property in museum or other cultural collections. Now New York does. It's very specific, and it's honestly, it gives the repository a lot of power and a very clear outline of what actually can happen with that material that is found without paperwork connected. So the Society of American Archivists Acquisitions and Appraisal section has put together a fantastic resource. It might be a little bit out of date at this point. I think it was, I'm not sure when it was last updated, but it's been a couple years. But their website, which there's a link here, lists all of the different states with links to their relevant abandoned property law. You have to do a little bit of digging in some of them, such as New York, but it's just a great resource for figuring out what the state legal ramifications are. So in New York, the applicable law is within the Education Law, Part 1, Section 233AA, Article 5. And I absolutely need to state, hopefully it goes without saying, but I am not an attorney. I have no legal training, expertise, or even knowledge beyond reading this law, so please do not take this as legal advice. However, the New York's law's statement on abandoned property is handled through the Office of the Comptroller, and on this slide it outlines here what your institution can do in the case of abandoned property to essentially make a good faith effort to track down the owner or original lender of material. So in order to undertake these actions, we're assuming that the object has been at the institution for at least 10 years. So after 10 years, if you know the original owner or lender, you can attempt to send them letters, and it outlines in the law, you know, exactly some of the criteria of what would make a formal official letter, if you have their address, of course. And if you don't know the lender, or if you don't have the owner or lender's address, there are guidelines on how to publicly publish information seeking ownership or even just further information in a newspaper of general circulation in the institution's county. And then after the publication, there's a process by which the information request goes directly through the comptroller's office, and then the end result of these, if you do make the good faith effort to track down a lender or owner and you are not able to, the object or collection becomes legally property of the institution, and so then the institution can do with it what they will. They can retroactively accession the material, or they can go through the processes of disposing of the material with the kind of ethical and legal framework to do that on the up and up. In other states where these laws are not as defined, legally and to a certain extent ethically, an institution does not really have any power to go either way with collections, so with found in collections. So that is, legally, the institution cannot either convert them formally into collections or even get rid of them. So it puts that as a real collection conundrum, and fortunately I'm relieved somewhat that I'm speaking to an audience today where it is a bit more spelled out. This slide also has some information on unsolicited property. We're going to talk more about loans in a little bit, and this falls sort of in the topic of loans, but essentially unsolicited property. Many institutions have had the issue of having potential donors, hopeful donors, I guess, prospective donors, just drop off material completely unsolicited, thinking that it would fit an institution's collecting policy or that it would be an interesting part of the collection, but there's little to no record and you don't necessarily want it, you don't know what to do with it. So that's addressed in this law as well. And it mentions that if, I'm not sure why 2009 is the date written in the law, but if the item was left at the institution after 2009, it becomes property of the institution if no one claims it within 90 days. No publication or letters or anything are required for that. So moving on to another, excuse me, needed to take a drink there. Another sometimes sticky and complex topic of deaccessions. So in a really robust and comprehensive collections management policy, there would definitely be an extensive section on how the institution handles deaccessions. So deaccessioning material from a collection is the permanent removal of previously accessioned materials from the institution's collection. So I emphasize that previously accessioned part because if it's not part of your collection, if it was merely an acquisition and not a formal accession, you don't have to go through the entire deaccessioning process. Now, there might be ethical considerations there that we'll talk a little more about in a few moments, but legally, the entire deaccessioning process does not have to be taken unless we're dealing with things that are formally part of the collection. Disposal then is not actually throwing something away, although it can be, but it's more generally than that, the mechanisms for actually getting rid of collections material that have been deaccessioned. So why would your institution choose to deaccession something? Well, the most kind of obvious and big reasoning would be that the material does not fit within your collecting scope. So maybe your collecting scope changed. Maybe you accepted something that 20 years ago seemed like a really great addition to the collection, but no longer is relevant because, for example, you moved from being a region-wide historical society to just a town-wide or even county-wide historical society. You may find yourself needing to formally deaccession unnecessary duplicates or over-representation of material within a collection. I should mention here, this would be a good point to mention that weeding is not deaccessioning. So we talked a little bit about weeding back in the deed of gift section. So having the power to, while you are processing a collection, be able to take out parts of it that are not relevant to the collection and discard of those, that does not necessarily need to go through the full formal deaccessioning process. But it's worth mentioning here because we do often get that question. Back to this list, material could be deaccessioned if you find that your institution is just no longer able or never was able to provide proper care or access to the materials, whether that's proper storage, whether that's audiovisual material that you don't have and anticipate never having playback equipment for. New information regarding provenance or title. So maybe the collection or the material isn't what you actually thought it would be. And that's also leads into the next one too, is that maybe the object was determined to be a fake or a forgery, something that was initially presented to your institution as the real deal. You find out that it's not what it was posing as. If an item has deteriorated beyond usefulness, so if the preservation issues, if an item has degraded to the point where you can't even pick it up and leaf through it, if it's in the case of a book or a volume, in the case of a photograph of a particular method that faded and cracked so much that you cannot even see what the image on the photograph is, and there is no prospect, no resources or intention or prospect of having formal conservation treatment done at any point in the future, that might be a reason to deaccession something if it's not presenting the contents in the way that can be used. And then, of course, if an object has been stolen and a certain time period has passed and there's no recourse for returning it, you would, or if it's been kind of irretrievably lost or destroyed, deaccessioning it is the way that you're kind of formally, intellectually removing the record of that object or collection from your repository's holdings. So some of the things that would be included in a deaccessioning policy are, of course, what reasons you might choose to deaccession material. So some of the reasons that we just went through in the last slide there. Stipulations and restrictions. For example, if your institution wants to assign a certain length of time that something must stay in the collection before it's deaccessioned. So if your institution would always keep something for 10 years before even considering deaccessioning it, that would be spelled out in your policy as well. It would, of course, also state in your policy, I would hope, that any deaccessioning decisions would need to go in tandem with potential conditions or restrictions placed on the object at the time of title transfer, so within the deed of gift. A deaccessioning policy can also start to get into the responsibilities of the staff and institution and basic procedures for actually carrying out deaccessioning. So who needs to initiate, who needs to ultimately approve a deaccession, who needs to initiate the conversation about a deaccession. The policy would likely state that the institution needs to outline that they do hold clear and formal title to the object. Some procedural things, getting into things like making sure that you're removing or obscuring accession numbers that may have been marked on or adhered to a collection or object. The policy should also state that you will retain documentation of the deaccession, so you have that in your files. And it might answer questions such as would you be contacting the donor? Are you going to make a promise and institutional obligation that you would let the donor know if something they donated was deaccessioned? So I would not personally, as speaking as a consultant, I would not recommend spelling that into your deaccessioning policy, just because it kind of creates problems. It can certainly be a public relation concern. It can also just be complex and difficult. If it's spelled into your policy that you need to do that, you would have to go through the process of contacting the donor. Will a list of deaccession material be published somewhere, for example, within your institutional newsletter, or within a board meeting's minutes, and then those minutes are formally published somewhere, or an annual report or something to that effect? So what actually happens when material is disposed of, quote unquote, after it's just deaccessioned? The different options are that the materials might be transferred to a different collection within the same institution. So we talked before about kind of upgrading items from a general collection into a special collection. Well, there might be a process of downgrading, essentially, items from a collection into a use collection, an educational collection, a props collection. It might be transferred to another institution. So if the item is deaccession because it doesn't quite adhere as directly to your collecting policy, but there is another institution out there that would want it, you could donate, transfer that to the other institution. Sale, we'll talk a little bit more about some of the ethical considerations of selling items that are deaccessioned in a second, but that is certainly an option. And also physical destruction, and that would probably only happen in certain cases where either an item is deemed very, very unlikely to have value to another institution or to another use, or if it has deteriorated beyond usefulness and there's no real potential to get use out of that item or collection in the future. So if something is destroyed, your institution does want to actually destroy it, as strange as that might sound, but for example, if it's a collection of papers, you would want to actually shred the papers. What you're trying to avoid there by actually destroying it is deaccessioning material, and then it literally ends up in the dumpster, and that can be kind of a public relations nightmare as well. That has definitely happened at some other repositories in the past. Some of the legal and ethical considerations of deaccessioning materials are kind of whether deaccessioning adheres with the institutional policies at all. So it's possible at some institutions there is kind of a statement, a policy that you will not deaccession materials because it is considered, some places institutionally, so ethically questionable and not worth the trouble, not worth the public relations potential. Of course, the original agreement with a donor might disallow it. If the donor is still living, that's not necessarily a reason not to do it, but it would be, you would want to consider, you know, the implications and ramifications for them. Are they an ongoing donor? Would they be offended if they found out about this? Would there be bad blood between the institution and some of their community or audience because of this? Who can obtain deaccession materials? So this is a really important ethical consideration that would probably be outlined in the policy as well. And that what frequently is outlined is disallowing staff, board members, volunteers, or other representatives of the institution from taking possession of the deaccession materials. An ethical consideration might be that often is also outlined in the deaccession policy is how sales will be handled, and sales should be handled, I'll mention, by a third party to maintain impartiality. So typically the ethical recommendation is to not only handle it by a third-party sale, but a third-party public sale in which there is no, private bidding or a direct one-to-one sale. So you're not deaccessioning something explicitly to sell it to a collector or a buyer. And then also the question of deaccessioning, in quotes, undocumented objects. So it's complicated, as we talked about before in the abandoned property section. The responsibility is not always clear. So really, if you want to deaccession something that you're not sure what your legal ownership is, in order to dot all of your I's and cross all of your T's, you would ideally want to consult a lawyer. One final thing I'll mention about proceeds from deaccessions is if the deaccession material is actually sold, there are ethical responsibilities and commitments about how those resources and the proceeds will actually be used. So the Society of American Archivists Code of Ethics does not actually directly address proceeds from deaccessions. There is an SAA policy on deaccessioning material that explicitly states the SAA Code of Ethics does not specifically address this. But it does recommend to look to codes of ethics for other like cultural collecting institutions, such as the American Alliance of Museums. So their code of ethics states that proceeds from the sale of non-living collections are to be used consistent with the established standards of the museum's discipline. And then, and this is the really important part, this next clause here, but in no event shall they be used for anything other than acquisition or direct care of collections. So that direct care of collections is quite, there's a lot of range there and variety, and that can be interpreted in different ways. So basically the proceeds from deaccessioning cannot be used for staff salaries. They cannot be used for an extensive capital campaign or something, but they can be used to purchase new collections. They can be used to enhance storage or processing materials or environmental controls for existing collections. They can be used for conservation treatment, conservation and preservation supplies, even for collections documentation and hiring consultants to work with the collection. So basically, if something is related to collections care directly, according to these codes of ethics, that is an appropriate use for deaccessioning proceeds. So moving on, we're going to talk a little more about documentation, so the actual records that an institution keeps about its collections. Documentation is really an institution's memory. Sometimes this is also referred to as intellectual control over the collections. Managing cultural collections, archives, museum collections is all about organizing collections in an understandable way that will be useful to the staff and users going forward. Also to enable you to find and access any object at a moment's notice, and to enable you to connect each object and collection to its paperwork, including when the object came to the institution, from whom, the title transfer, even a history of the object or collection, the record of the object or collection at the institution, certainly the description of the object or collection, borrowing or transferring the object from one institution to another. And on this slide, it just lists some of the many different types of documentation that can be implemented over a collection. So here are, I wanted to go in a little bit more detail about the descriptive records and give definitions, although if you read through the slide, you'll see that there's something slightly humorous about these definitions. Definitions of the different types of descriptive records that an institution might use: catalog, finding aid, and inventory. So the funny thing is, the kind of mildly humorous thing is, these descriptions are all so vague. These are all from the SAA glossary, so they're official definitions from that publication, but they're, I mean, particularly inventory, that it's a list of things. That's not all that it is, but the extent of the definition is a list of things. So any objects or collections within an institution should have some descriptive information about it, and the kind of extent and depth of that information is going to determine to a certain extent whether it would be considered an inventory, so just a list of holdings, a catalog record, so a bit more in depth about a collection, some sort of systematically arranged descriptions of all of the materials within your repository, or the kind of greatest level of granular detail of finding aid. So, of course, if we're all coming from archival collections, we are very familiar with finding aids, a tool that facilitates discovery of information within the collection, so in much greater depth than, say, a catalog record would. But because the inventory definition here is so vague, I wanted to go into a little bit more depth about what I actually mean when I'm talking about inventory. So an inventory is a list of things, but more than that, I would say it's a formal list of the property in a repository, ideally connecting the physical object to a location, to a number in the catalog or some other formal record. These are different types of inventories. So basically, I mean, in its basic essence, an inventory, a formal list of the property within a repository, but it's going through your collection storage and making a list of what you have on the shelves, or in thinking about inventorying particular collections before you actually start doing a more in-depth processing. Inventorying the collection is getting a sense of the size, scope, formats represented. So it's not really intensive, granular, descriptive information about the collections, but it's the overall kind of volume counts, space counts, those types of statistics about the collections. So this slide lists some different approaches to taking inventories that you might conduct at an institution. If you are again, in referring to overall collections inventories, not the pre-processing inventory of a particular collection, but some of the reasons for inventorying materials might be to determine all of the objects that are held within a collection and their locations. I mentioned previously, it's really great when an inventory can provide some location connection to be able to actually not only know that you have something, but know where to find it on the shelf. To determine the exact number of objects or materials in the collection, so to get those kind of volume counts. To estimate space needs, potentially for renovation or moving. For security purposes, so to determine what you have on the shelf in storage in order to then, the next point might be to determine what is missing, lost, misplaced, or stolen. To retrieve information after a catastrophic loss. So if your institution suffers an emergency or disaster in which the collections are impacted, you would definitely want to take an inventory to see what is still on the shelf and what kind of its status and condition is. To determine what objects are not cataloged or that have incomplete records. So you might take an inventory in order to initiate kind of next steps of description and processing. In thinking about your collecting plan, and taking an inventory would help inform you about what your institution actually collects and determining holes in the collection. It might help initiate resource allocation questions, like determining budget requirements for housing or conservation needs. It might be in initiating conversations and decisions about deaccessioning. There might be insurance questions, reassessing your insurance policies that you would need to get some of these volume counts, space counts for. So I mentioned on the bottom here, some of those reasons for inventorying a collection I mentioned might kind of trigger other actions. And that's where there's a bit of a fine line between inventorying collections and doing some more in-depth surveys of collections. But there is a distinction. So a collection survey is when you're actually looking a little more carefully at the collections, the objects themselves, to determine, for example, preservation needs, actual processing priorities, reformatting or digitization priorities, etc. So that's going in a little more depth than just the kind of scanning the shelves inventory. Okay, a couple more things to get through before I'm going to be ready for questions. One other topic area that's involved in collections management is loans. And so there are obviously two big picture different types of loans: outgoing loans, where you are loaning your collections to another institution, and incoming loans, where another institution or donor is loaning items, materials to your institution. So a lot that could be said about loans would probably fit better into an exhibition webinar, or even an insurance risk management webinar or program, but we are going to talk about it a little bit here because it certainly has an impact on caring for and administering collections at your institution. So I'm going to be talking about outgoing loans and incoming loans in the next couple slides in terms of what you might include in a loan policy, loan forms, and documentation. So a section that outlines information on loaning your collections to another institution might identify to whom the institution will make loans. So is your institution only going to loan materials to other museums, other archives, other nonprofits, or would you loan your materials to anyone? Would a borrowing institution have to fill out a standard facilities report to make sure that their facilities are on par with your institution's facilities? So essentially, you're not going to be moving your collections to a subpar environment or building situation. A loan policy might restrict some collections entirely from loans. So if an item or collection is just so integral to your institution, whether it's to your exhibition program or to your researchers' needs, that you couldn't really stand to have it off-site, you might just make the decision to never loan it out to another institution. Acceptable purposes for loaned materials. So would they always have to go into an exhibition? Could materials be loaned out for, say, reformatting or a different type of use, research use at a different institution? Requirements of the borrower, this is a big one, and this is one that there would probably be a lot of requirements spelled out within a loan agreement, but what are you actually asking the borrower to promise? Are you asking them to provide all of the packing, transportation, and insurance? Are you asking them to conduct condition reports upon receipt and removal? Are you asking them to take a photo documentation of your object in situ if it's in an exhibition? Loan policies would definitely spell out the length of a loan, so you might not have it written into your policy statement, a specific number, but you would need to identify that loans, especially for outgoing loans of your collections, are not going to be indefinite, that there is an end in sight, and at the end of that loan term, the paperwork and loan agreements would probably need to be renegotiated and renewed. What types of documentation are you going to keep regarding the loan? So, what records are created, with what loan agreements are transacted between the two institutions? What would happen if, we certainly hope it wouldn't come to this, but if something were damaged, what are the obligations of the borrower there in terms of emergency conservation, salvage, retrieval of damaged loan materials? And then how, I think I mentioned previously in the requirements of the borrower, but how is packing, transportation, and insurance handled? So in terms of incoming loans, what your policy might spell out here is why your institution might borrow materials that belong to another institution or a donor. Acceptable uses there. Who within your staff or volunteer institutional structure is responsible for initiating and requesting materials to borrow? Conversely to what would happen if something were damaged at another institution, what would happen if something were damaged at your institution? What obligations does your institution have to repairing and performing conservation treatment on damaged materials? The duration of the loan, the packing, transportation, and insurance, the loan documentation. Basically, it's just all of the same considerations, but thinking about them in a different direction, where your institution has these responsibilities, and whereas in the previous slide, of course, it's the other borrowing institution that has these responsibilities. In thinking about incoming loans, these materials that are borrowed, for example, for an exhibition or for the use of your researchers or your staff to research, those are kind of the simple questions. What are the real collections conundrums about loans? So the big question that I often get is sort of related, and it can be directly related, but not always, to the found-in collections and abandoned property questions, and that is indefinite loans or even deposits. So what are sometimes known as permanent loans, but as John Simmons points out in his book, Things Great and Small, Collections Management Policies, which is another recommended resource you'll get on your resource list at the end, a permanent loan is really an oxymoron. So it's used to just essentially mean a loan with no specified ending date. So a permanent loan would much more accurately be described as an indefinite loan because it's not a gift, it's a loan. The donor is not giving it to your institution, but so they're not transferring the title and ownership, but there is some expectation that it will just be at your institution kind of in perpetuity. So it probably goes somewhat without saying that this is a conundrum. It's not an ideal situation. It's not an ideal situation because the responsibilities are really unclear. Because if there's no loan paperwork or documentation that identifies these responsibilities and has an end termination date, the different parties might not know, for example, whose responsibility it is to make sure that a particular collection or object has insurance coverage or it will be conserved in the event that it's damaged or just starts degrading because it's been on exhibition for 40 years. So these are these tricky type of situations that hopefully we would hope that going forward your institution can try to not find itself in, but we understand that it's very common for these either indefinite loans or just kind of unclear ownership situations of loans to exist. And then here again, we're going back to the abandoned property situation of anytime that you can, you would want to kind of retroactively initiate more formal paperwork to document an agreement. So anytime you know the lender, you should ideally really encourage them to make the transaction more formal. But if you don't know them, or if you can't get in touch with them, etc., you're going back to the abandoned property situations. I mentioned deposits here as well because depositing material into one repository from another is another type of arrangement that ideally there are formal agreements around, so formal terms and conditions around the actual storing of material from one collection and another, but sometimes in reality there just aren't those formal agreements, and so then it gets into the more complicated questions as well. Unsolicited deposits that I mentioned in the abandoned property section when we were talking about the unsolicited property and what the legal responsibilities there are often known also as doorstep donations. So something literally just being dropped off at the doorstep of an institution. And that's unfortunately not uncommon with archival collections, historical societies. I worked with a historic house in Philadelphia, and their collecting policy was very, very specific. They very specifically collect materials related to representing and previously belonging to these several particular Philadelphia families. And the collection is really interesting. It's very extensive. The families were traveling, almost exploring collectors. So there's quite a bit to be collected and to exist in the collection and be exhibited in this historic house just documenting those families. However, it is a very well-regarded historic house within its particular neighborhood in Philadelphia, and it is maybe the only kind of somewhat high-profile cultural institution within that immediate neighborhood, and so the rapport with the community has been kind of a blessing and a curse in that the way that their curator spoke to me about it once, she mentioned that they had turned into a, quote, dumping ground for the historic Northeast. So anyone in northeastern Philadelphia, you know, kind of felt like if they had stuff that might even be considered vaguely historic, they would offer it to and sometimes literally leave it on the doorstep of this particular institution. And so those are those types of unsolicited deposits that you don't quite know what to do with. Sometimes they might be really valuable and have a great deal of worth to your collection and your collecting mission, but sometimes they might really just be the product of a dumping ground. So the final thing that I want to talk about before we will definitely have time for questions is how these collections management decisions actually get made. And so in practice, a lot of times it's just the collecting staff or staff volunteers making the decisions, so the archivist, the curator, the registrar. But ideally, and this goes for institutions large and small, it's really helpful to have some kind of outside body, an advisory body that would help guide the decisions and even remove the burden of sometimes tough decisions from collection staff. So you could establish a collections committee. It might be a subcommittee of your board. It might be separate from that entirely. And skipping to, if you're looking at the slide, skipping to the last point here, a collections committee could be comprised of, you would certainly want representation from collection staff, could also include interested board members, members of the administration, so the authority within the institution, and even outside experts. So for example, a preservation professional, subject area experts in the collecting areas of your repository, representative users. For an academic, a collection at an academic institution, perhaps a professor or faculty member in a department that really actively either uses your repository's collections or teaches on similar subjects to those collected within within their coursework. Representative users might be potential researchers or other individuals there. And so the collections committee would be able to help really guide the collecting of an institution. So some of the activities that a collections committee could take out would be those to help shape the collection to fit your institutional mission, to make sure that you're adhering to your collection development policy, the descriptions of the collection that you have kind of coded into your collections management policy and your overall conceptual framework for collecting. A collections committee might be the body that has the actual authority to authorize the acceptance of collections from donors, the purchase of collections, and deaccession. So having those decisions, need to go through an extra step would make sure that the repository is maintaining the highest ethical standards when they're either accepting or materials or discarding materials. So all decisions should be open to scrutiny. It should not be a situation where a curator or an archivist or a registrar has to have a position of authority that would either be uncomfortable or that would be unethical. A great thing about a collections committee is that it can provide a way to kind of gracefully not accept donations when your repository is become the dumping ground of the historic Northeast. So when you're the last stop on the way to the junkyard, you can point to, well, I, as the curator, really appreciate this donation, but it has to pass the muster of the collections committee, and so we'll bring it to our next committee meeting and see where we go. But the committee would help provide a mechanism to really efficiently shape and form the collection so that it meets the mission. A collections committee could also be a really valuable outreach service in terms of promoting the collection, awareness of the resources, advocating for the collection, even cultivating donors. So I serve on the collections committee for a very small archival, a very small institution with a not small relative to the institution, but kind of resource-wise, operations-wise, small archival collection. I serve on their collections committee as a preservation professional, and other members on that committee are, as I mentioned before, subject experts, prospective users, but the committee is one really wonderful benefit of the meetings is brainstorming, as I mentioned, those potential donors and potential places where if your repository is really actively collecting and looking to build the collection, potential places where you could go to try to build and acquire more materials for the collection. A collections committee might or might not, but might have be able to weigh in on exhibition considerations as well as considerations for the permanent collection. So they might be involved with evaluating loan opportunities as well. So if you are going to have a collections committee have this ultimate authority and the responsibility is theirs, that would need to be written into your collections management policy. It would need to state that the committee would be tasked with evaluating and accepting the objects and other materials presented for donation or kind of desired for purchase to the institution. And it would also most likely be hardwired into your collections policy that the collections committee would hear about deaccessioning and make the authoritative decisions on that as well. So it kind of depends within your institution how much authority a collections committee would have. Maybe they wouldn't have the authority to ultimately make these decisions, but maybe it would just be a kind of advisory body to report the decisions to. But maybe for ethical reasons, you would want, again, to have that kind of separate, not so much a governing body, but separate decision-making body. And with that, those are some of the individuals who might be able to help you talk about some of these collections management decisions, issues that we've been talking about throughout the past hour and a half. These are some additional resources that I would really recommend looking into. Particularly, I would highly recommend, I mentioned the collections conundrums before. I would also highly recommend if your institution does not have a collections management policy, or if you're interested in really revamping, updating, or expanding your collections management policy, I would highly recommend that last volume, John Simmons' Things Great and Small, Collections Management Policies. This publication goes into great depth on developing a collections management policy, and there's on that slide that I showed you previously that identified all the potential sections that could be in a policy like this. He basically has a chapter and even sample policies for each one of those sections. So it goes into a lot greater depth about some really important collections management considerations. So with that, and this webinar, of course, probably should have mentioned it at the beginning, is being recorded, so you'll be able to go back and look over all of this afterwards through the DHPSNY website. But with that, I want to turn it over for questions. So if you have questions, please go ahead and type them in the question box, and I'll try to, we definitely have time, so I'll try to do what I can with answering them. You should certainly always feel free to reach out to me either through phone or email. My contact information is here on the screen. Keep it open for questions for a couple more minutes. Let's see. Okay. Okay, one question says, do you keep the names of borrowers indefinitely? So if and presumably I'm thinking that means the person who asked the question, and you can type in a new question if I'm understanding it wrong. I am assuming that that means if you're loaning your materials from your collection to another institution or to another entity. I would say yes. So as long as you have the collection, as long as you have the object as part of your collection, hopefully you would have some object record, catalog record, some documentation of that within your repository's records holdings. And yes, if the collection is loaned, if the object is loaned out to another institution, I think you would include that in the object record and then keep that with the object record essentially indefinitely. So you would know, it would just be part of the history and experience of the object. Let's see. Okay, here's another. This is a tricky question. If a donor has died, can you assume ownership when no formal acquisitions processes have been done in the past? No, not necessarily. So if a donor has died, if you know who the donor was and you know that they have passed away, the ownership could conceptually go to their estate. So if you are able to contact their estate and whatever entity, whomever the rest of their estate has gone to, you would want to contact them and see if they are going to claim title, claim ownership of the item. It wouldn't, there's not an automatic transfer to the institution. Now, it definitely may be the case that the estate, the family members, whomever you're dealing with after the original donor has passed, would say, "Oh, you have that collection, that object? Absolutely. I would love to complete a deed of gift going forward. I know that's what my grandfather would have wanted, and that I'm sure that's what his intentions were." And then your institution would have the opportunity to complete that deed of gift paperwork then, but no, it would not be legally assumed. Let's see. Are the slides, oh, see, I have to apologize. I'm not sure exactly how this works. I see that my colleague has answered. It indicates that my colleague, okay. Amelia, yeah, the slides from this webinar are available for download or print out, and my colleague Amelia responds that the webinar slides will be posted next week. So yes, and another question in that same vein, another person asked if we could put the list of books here. You would be able to get that list of resources when the webinar slides are posted as well. Let's see. Is there a set of templates available for download for creating the various documents you've spoken about? So we do have a program coming up that's going to be more specifically on written policies and procedures, an in-person program that's going to be happening this spring, and I think part of the information for that will be connecting you with other kind of policy templates and materials like that. I will say, just off the top of my head, the Society of Georgia Archivists has a really fantastic forms website. Off the top of my head, I do not have the URL for that website, but I imagine if you searched Society of Georgia Archivists forms templates, you would be able to find that website fairly quickly. It lists sample forms from other institutions, primarily within Georgia, but there's only in the case of those state laws that we discussed earlier would that make any difference whatsoever where the institution is. But that's a really fantastic resource. There's another relatively new wiki for sample archival and special collections policies that I think is managed through Bowling Green State University. And maybe we can send out the URL to that as well following this webinar. Amelia included the Society of Georgia Archivists web URL right there, and following up, maybe we can send out the URL for the other sample policy website as well. There are a couple sample policy, so not the blank templates, but examples of other institutions' policies in these categories. A few kind of online clearinghouses for those, but they tend to, they're great when they're first created, but they tend to experience what's called link rot really quickly, where the URLs that they're linking to change because they're directly linking to institutionals' own websites, and their websites change and everything. So there are some. It's kind of a snowballing situation where as soon as a really great collection management policy resource pops up a year later, it's already out of date. That said, as I mentioned, there is this newish one from, like I said, I'm pretty sure it's Bowling Green, that is new enough that most of the information there should still be good. Okay. What is a good resource for digital collection? So I'm not sure specifically what the extent of what you mean by that. There are few DHPSNY webinars either that have previously concluded that you could go back and watch through the website, or that are coming up that are going to be related to digital collections. But without knowing more specifically what the participant is asking about, I'm not really sure what more to information to provide there. Let's see. If an object has an accession number but no other documentation, is it still always considered part of the collection? Well, you might have to take somewhat of a risk management approach to the way you're thinking about that. So sure, there might be an assumption made there, but not if you needed to back up that assumption in court, you might not be able to without having accession paperwork or deed of gift. It can be a really helpful clue and indication that at some point an object was formally accessioned, but the extent of that, having the kind of full legal knowledge of the status of that, could not necessarily be assumed just by having the accession number. You mentioned that weeding found in collection artifacts is not the same as, need not be as complex as deaccessioning. Would you please clarify that? I would be happy to clarify that, and I think if that, I did not mean, that's not the suggestion that I really meant to impart. So I'm glad to have the opportunity to clarify that. When I was talking about weeding in kind of the same section as dealing with found in collections artifacts, I was talking about how when you're processing a collection, and this is, I'm thinking specifically in terms of archival processing, when you're processing a collection, there's part of processing that is always weeding, so removing duplicates, removing extraneous information that you don't want to kind of keep as part of the collection. That weeding does not need to go through the formal deaccessioning process. So, for example, you're processing a collection of theater playbills. You have 10 playbills from the exact same production. If you are going to weed and discard of 7 of those playbills, you don't have to go through the formal deaccessioning process of in order to get rid of all of those. You can just weed them and do with them whatever you typically do with weeded materials while you're processing collections. That's what I meant there. In relation to found-in collections, what the issue with deaccessioning found-in collections is that it's really tricky because you can't formally deaccession something from your collection until you know that you have formally accessioned it in the first place. So if there are found-in collections that you would like to get rid of, that becomes a very tricky legal and ethical consideration of, do we actually own this material? And what are our responsibilities? So it's not quite as simple as weeding there. Let's see. If deaccession items are offered to another institution, who pays shipping or transportation costs if they are considerable? The donating institution, the receiving one, or shared. We're all volunteer and are giving a large collection to a well-funded university archives. There's not really a hard and fast magic bullet answer to that question, but I would say that typically it would be the receiving institution. Because they're the ones that are kind of benefiting from the donation. So offering up those shipping resources, transportation arrangements would be often part of the agreement. Now, it might not necessarily be the case. Maybe your institution just wants to get rid of something so desperately that you're willing to arrange for all of the shipping and transportation and all of that in order to free up the space and resources at your institution. But I would think that it would be more commonly the receiving institution. Could you provide a resource for how to label various items permanently? So one of the, we can probably, I'm not 100% certain if they're there now, but we have a DHPSNY resource page on our website with a section of all sorts of various resources related to archival, collections management, preservation, etc. And if there is not a resource up there about labeling, we can put it on the list and make sure to add something up there. I will also mention that in terms of permanent or semi-permanent object labeling, one of the resources on my resource slide, Museum Registration Methods, specifically the 5th edition volume, has some great information on marking and labeling. So I would definitely consider consulting that volume as well. Any other questions? Please feel absolutely free to call me or email me with any follow-up questions. One of the services that the Conservation Center does through our Preservation Services Department is consulting on collections policies and on collections management issues. So it's something that we work with all the time here and have worked with many different types of institutions, large and small. So hopefully I would have at least have heard something similar to your collections conundrums in the past and try and guide you in a good direction. But if there are no other questions right now, I am actually in just a little bit going to be departing my Philadelphia office and heading into New York for some DHPSNY work myself, so I will be joining your fair state in just a few hours. So have a good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Again, this webinar has been recording and will be available for re-listening and watching afterwards, as well as the slides will be posted separately as well. So thanks everyone, and please let me know if you have additional questions, concerns, thoughts, etc. And have a wonderful afternoon. Take care. Bye.